So I started off life, probably by my second year of life, I was living in the Pimlico neighborhood with my parents. We actually lived right next to the Pimlico racetrack on a street called Queensberry Avenue, typical Baltimore row house. I remember riding my little bike there and having friends. And so here's a story that will date me. This is unbelievable. But Queensberry Avenue was right off of Belvedere Avenue, and Belvedere Avenue was a couple blocks from Park Heights. On Park Heights at that time, there was an A&P grocery store. So this is maybe 4 or 5 blocks from my house. My mother says at that time, when I was a baby, she would put me in the baby carriage, wheel me to the grocery store, and like the other mothers, they left the carriage with their babies in it outside the store while they went in shopping. Amazing. They shopped and came out, and the babies were still in the baby carriage. So that was my orientation to the neighborhood. When I was 4, my mother was pregnant. They needed a bigger place, so they moved to Narcissus Avenue, another place in the Pimlico neighborhood. Narcissus is off of Rogers near Northern Parkway. It's right across from Arlington Elementary School. It was another row house, a little bigger. And what was very convenient for me was that my school was directly across the street. So every day I would go to school. I would even come home on the lunchtime. My mother stayed at home. She'd make grilled cheese sandwiches, and we had that for lunch. We also played a lot in the neighborhood. I don't remember ever having fear or being told not to go certain places. A typical summer day when I was 10 or 11, my friend and I would get on our bikes. Our mother would give us a peanut butter sandwich, and all she would say is, "Be home for dinner at 5. Where we went, and it was fine. Came home not knowing that 4 months after I came home, Martin Luther King was going to be assassinated, and then we had riots, uprisings in Baltimore with the National Guard tanks coming through the city. And at that time, I decided that I needed to get involved. I had never been involved in social action, but I needed to get involved. And there was a project that Kennedy and Johnson had called the VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America. And I applied to be a VISTA volunteer. And I very much wanted to go to a Black community in Roxbury. However, at that time, VISTA said they did not want to put a young white person in Roxbury. I should also say, and this is very important, my awareness of Black people growing up was really that we had a maid, that's what it's called, a maid, a person who came from downtown to work in our house. Our family didn't have a lot of money. But this person came twice a week, cleaned the house, and did some minor caretaking for me and my sister, did ironing. I remember being interested, asking questions. I didn't always get answers. I don't ever remember being afraid. I don't ever remember being told I shouldn't talk to them, but it was like another world to me. I do remember that sometimes when I got older in high school and go on dates, the boy who was driving the car would always say, "We're going through this bad neighborhood. You need to get down. They can't see you." And I'm like, no, I'm curious. I want to see. I want to be seen. So it was really curiosity with a strong feeling. Then in my class at Arlington Elementary School, it was obviously all white. It was called like an enrichment class. So if they track kids, I guess this would be like the smartest class. We were pretty much the same white Jewish kids all the time. We went to the same Sunday school, the same Girl Scouts. We were in this class. However, in the 6th grade, suddenly there's a Black girl in the class. Well, obviously, this was after the Brown Supreme Court decision. There was no introduction of this girl. We weren't told why she was there. We weren't told anything about her. I remember her sitting there the whole year, focusing on the books. I don't know if any of us offered to play with her. Obviously, it was terribly awkward. I do remember that in this class of smart kids, she probably wound up being one of the very smartest kids. I do remember that. but there was no segue. So what I'm saying is my whole life in Baltimore with the Black population here, I never really got to know anyone as people. So I didn't get to know Black people as I was growing up in Baltimore because of the segregation and various attitudes. But I was always curious. That was my main feeling. I was curious. I didn't obviously understand what was going on. So then it was 1968, and I had been through college, and I had had a couple jobs. I came back here, and Martin Luther King was assassinated, and we had National Guard tanks. At that point, I decided I wanted to get involved in social action. I applied to VISTA, Volunteers in Service of America. It was a project called the Domestic Peace Corps. You would volunteer for a year. Even though, obviously, there were a lot of social action, racial issues in Baltimore, at that point, VISTA's policy, they didn't want to place you in your own town. They thought you'd be too beholden to people. So I wanted to go to Roxbury, Boston, Black area, and they said they wouldn't send a white person there. So I was kind of dismayed. They said they were going to send me to Portland, Maine. I was very upset. It was an all-white area, and I didn't think that's where I should go. But I went there. It was mainly Italian, American, and French Canadian. Anyhow, it was a lot of poor white people in there, and I learned a lot that year. Then I always had this thing in my mind that I wanted to go to Roxbury. So after that, I was about 15 months in Maine. I then got my wish. I moved to Boston, and I got a job working as a tenant relations organizer for a low-income housing place. And that's actually, ironically, I had a Black boss, a man from Towson who had come up north, and was working with Black clients in low-income housing as well as people from other nations. I was doing some PR stuff with a photographer who was Black. I had some relationships with Black men, Black women, and that's the first time I got to know Black people as people. The history of my neighborhood has had a lot of changes. First of all, as a Jewish person, I grew up, I was told we were Orthodox. By then, standards back then in the 50s, possibly we were. By standards now, we have a much more observant Orthodox population that I didn't see here that much. So clearly, I would say the neighborhood has gotten more Jewish people moving from elsewhere, more observant. And the big thing is we have a lot of Jewish institutions. So a Jewish person could live here and conduct their whole life here. They would never have to go downtown or to any other part of town. And that's amazing because we always had to go other places. So there's a lot more Jewish influence. At the same time, the neighborhood with Blacks and Jews is not fully integrated, but clearly there's a lot closer living things, working things. People are more involved with one another. I like to believe with less fear, with more respect to each other. I actually have worked for CHI, an organization that's through the Jewish Associated, but we had Black people on staff. I've worked with the JCC. One of my fondest memories of growing up here was being able to go anywhere and do anything and not have fear, to be able to ride my bike as a kid, skate as a kid, take buses as a kid, walk to school as a kid, an younger child, older child. Nobody told me to worry about anything. I wasn't worried about anything, and it was a very easy movement. My experience is broadening all the time in knowing people from different backgrounds. As a Jewish person, but not a particularly observant Jewish person, I met some very Orthodox Jews. I've worked in situations in schools with some Orthodox Jews, and their way of life can be very different than mine. I've worked with Black people in different groups. I worked for a group called Chai in the neighborhood, a neighborhood stabilization group, and I both worked there and volunteered there. As a volunteer, I set up a interracial dialogue group with seniors called Northwest Neighbors Connecting, and I did some training of people and basically how to listen in an empathic way. And while I'm not still involved with the group, I'm happy to say that group I started in 2012. It's 2021, and the group's still continuing. The goal was that it was not an advocacy group. It was not a social action group. It was a getting to know each other underneath the surface group. And from that group, some people have become true friends. And I have made some true friends in that group. And that's a godsend. I realize there's a push now. Well, it's a reality because we're living together, and the pandemic has kind of brought us back to some of the basic no-frills reality of life, how we all need to live and work and get along. And the question is, how do we get along when people have some very diverse backgrounds? And there's nothing like talking and really hearing somebody. Years ago, I started a group of seniors, because I was a senior, of Blacks and Jews talking to one another. And one of the first things I found out was Blacks and Jews who were homeowners, who had lived in the same neighborhood for years, never talked to each other, did not know anything. If they knew anything, this is really terrible, but a Jewish person would ask a Black person to come over on the Sabbath and turn the lights on. And the Black person did it, to be gracious, had no idea why they were doing it, what that meant. And that was where the relationship stopped. Well, I'm glad to say I think there's been various programs and groups and impetus to go beyond that. And people do know more about each other now. At the same time, I'm aware that we have a large Hispanic population here, population from the Caribbean islands, certainly a Russian population, that I certainly could stand to know more about. We have a couple places here where the businesses have signs in English, Hebrew, and Spanish, and Russian. And that's a good sign, I think. So something I've thought a lot about, both from my work and living in the community and as a volunteer for different projects, is how we bring seniors and youth together. There's a lot of seniors in this area, a lot, and they have needs. And one of the mantras of working with seniors is what's called aging in place. And the idea is, how do you keep seniors aging in their own homes or apartments, which most seniors want to do? Well, the answer is you have to bring resources. Where do the resources come from? Particularly since many people here are on fixed or limited incomes. Well, you've got youth. Youth needs service learning hours. Is there a way to combine that? I've worked in some projects where we were able to make that connection. We were able to get some of the youth to do some snow shoveling or do raking of leaves. As with many things with volunteers, when school work becomes a lot, sometimes volunteers don't always show up. But I think that's something, it has to go both ways. It can't just seem like we want the energy of youth to help seniors do free work that they don't have to pay for. The youth needs to get something. So I do know of some people who've made arrangements where they'll cook meals for the kids, or in one case, from a Jewish school, young girl wanted to learn Yiddish, Jewish language that's not spoken much anymore, and an older person would help them learn Yiddish if they would help the older person in the house. So I think that's an area that needs to continue to be explored, youth and older people, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think an interesting thing to mention is the existence of Sinai Hospital. Sinai Hospital is now in the Pimlico neighborhood on Northern Parkway in Belvedere. Sinai Hospital used to be in downtown Baltimore on Monument Street, obviously a much smaller building. It finally moved up to this area in the late 50s. Just to show the changes, Sinai Hospital came into existence because back in the 20s, 30s, Jews really were not invited into other hospitals. Sinai Hospital was the Jewish hospital. The Jewish doctors needed to practice at Sinai Hospital. As amazing as it sounds, well, my parents were born and raised in Baltimore, and as I said, I was, and my sister was. It turned out that my mother, my father, my sister, and I each had the same OBGYN. It sounds unbelievable, but when you think of it, there was one hospital and not that many Jewish OBGYNs at the time, so that's whose hands we started out life in. Sinai Hospital now, obviously, is much more inclusive, and people of all backgrounds, races. Sinai Hospital, in fact, Sinai Hospital intentionally reaches out to all parts of the community with different health, continuing education, health projects. So as a senior, I kind of live by the mantra, age in place, and my hope, as many seniors' fondest hope is that we do not ever have to move to a senior institution. So to that end, we hope to live wherever we are, whether it's in a house, condo, apartment building, with resources, enough resources. Some we'll have to pay for, others we hope that there will be enough organizations and projects in the neighborhood to provide those resources. So my dream for this neighborhood is that people become aware of the needs of seniors and help to provide for us to stay in place, and that we can create a neighborhood that feels safer. Crime has definitely increased. We're very fortunate. We do have neighborhood patrols, which have definitely helped, but even so, crime has increased. Certainly for seniors and for anyone to continue to stay in this neighborhood, we need to create a safer environment.